we all grow up in a society, right?
Right.
Following its rules and traditions and like all the ways that it does things. But have you ever just stopped to think about how those things actually came to be? Like, what if we just like design a culture from scratch? What would that even look like?
Well, that is a really intriguing question, and it's actually something that B.F. Skinner tackled in his book, Science and Human Behavior.
Oh,
Yeah. In chapter 28, he kind of goes headfirst into this whole idea of creating a culture intentionally to influence how people behave. It's pretty complex stuff, but
you bet.
yeah, it gets to the core of how we understand societies and how they work.
So we're diving into chapter 28 of Science and Human Behavior.
Yes.
I'm already feeling like I need to grab a notebook for this one.
Yeah.
So where do we even begin with something as big as like designing a culture?
Well, Skinner starts by pointing out something that I think is pretty surprising.
Hmm.
A lot of what we think of as culture isn't necessarily something that was designed on purpose.
Interesting.
Yeah. It's often the result of like chance encounters, you know, influential people, or even just weird geographic things. He argues that things didn't necessarily develop because they were the best solutions, but they just kind of happened that way.
So you're saying that our laws, our customs, even like the way we structure our economy could all be because of some historical accident?
Exactly.
Like what? Like a leader just decided to do something or some random event that just like snowballed into a tradition.
Yeah, like take the example of the QWERTY keyboard.
Okay, yeah.
It was designed to slow typists down so the keys wouldn't jam on early typewriters.
Okay.
But we don't have that problem anymore. But we're still stuck with a keyboard layout that's not the best, not the most efficient.
Right. It's just what we're used to.
Yeah, it's a classic example of how a solution to one problem can just become a permanent part of a culture, even if it's not the best solution anymore.
Oh, that's a great example. It makes you wonder how many other things we do just because that's how it's always been done, you know, without even asking if there's a better way.
Yeah.
So if cultures are so shaped by these accidents, does that mean we're just stuck with whatever we inherit? Like, can we even change things on purpose?
Well, that's where things get really interesting. Humans have always been trying to shape their cultures, even if they didn't always understand the science behind what they were doing.
Right.
Skinner points to things like religious texts, legal systems, how we educate people, even those utopian communities, as examples of how people try to intentionally influence behavior within a society.
So it's like we've been messing around with cultural design all along, but maybe not really understanding the impact of what we were doing.
Yeah.
Like, how effective have these efforts really been? Has anyone ever actually made a perfect culture based on how they wanted to design it?
Well, that's a tough question. Skinner says how well these attempts work depends on really understanding the science of how people behave. You know, specifically how things like reinforcement and punishment, whether we mean to use them or not, shape what we do. But, and here's like a really big philosophical question, people are also driven by their values, by their ideas of how things should be, and that can complicate things.
Okay, now we're getting into the stuff that really makes you think. Can science actually tell us what kind of culture we should have? Isn't that more of a value judgment, something beyond what science can really tell us?
Well, that's the big debate, right? Where does science stop and philosophy start? Skinner's argument is that even words like ought and should, which seem so tied to our personal values, can be analyzed scientifically by looking at what happens because of actions, you know, the consequences. He's not saying that science can tell us what our values should be, but more like it can help us understand what might happen because of those values.
Okay, can you give me an example? Help me really understand how this works, like practically.
Sure, yeah. Let's say there's a society that values individual freedom above all else.
Sounds pretty good.
Sounds great, right. But imagine if that focus on freedom leads to people doing things that harm the environment or create a ton of inequality.
Oh, I see.
All of a sudden, you have a situation where a value that everyone loves, when you see it play out in the real world, leads to consequences that might actually hurt that society in the long run.
That's a really good point. It shows how even values that we think are good can have unexpected consequences. So science can help us see those potential consequences more clearly, even if it can't tell us which values are right or wrong.
Exactly.
Okay.
It's about using science as a way to better understand how our choices and what happens because of them are connected. It's about being more aware of the long-term effects of the values that we choose to focus on in our cultures.
This is so interesting, but it's also making me realize how complicated this whole thing about designing a culture really is. We can't just like snap our fingers and create a utopia. So where do we go from here? If cultures are this mix of accidents and intention, and science can't give us all the answers, how do we even start to think about designing a better world?
Well, that's the question that Skinner really grapples with. He thinks we can look to nature for some guidance.
Okay.
He compares how cultures evolve to how species evolve, arguing that the cultures that survive are the ones that adapt best to their environments.
So is he saying that survival of the fittest applies to cultures too? But doesn't that take us down a kind of dangerous path? Does that mean that survival is the ultimate measure of whether a culture is successful, even if surviving means giving up other values like happiness or individual expression?
Yeah, that's the tough part, isn't it? Like, figuring out what fittest even means when we're talking about cultures. Surviving might be like a basic requirement, but it's probably not enough for a society to really thrive. We got to think about what kind of survival we're aiming for.
Right.
A society could survive by being super strict and controlling, but that might mean people aren't happy and they can't be creative.
So it's about finding a balance, right?
Yeah.
We need cultures that can change and survive, but also let people be themselves and don't just throw away important values just to exist. But who decides what the right balance is?
Well, Skinner doesn't give us a simple answer to that one.
Yeah, figures.
He admits that figuring out the best culture is a super complicated, probably impossible thing to do. Different groups are going to have different values and
Yeah.
priorities, and what works in one place might totally fail somewhere else.
Right, of course.
But he says science can at least give us some clues.
Okay, so how's that? If we can't even agree on what a good culture looks like, how can science help us design one?
Well, remember what we talked about before. Science can help us see the connection between what we do and what happens because of it. It can help us understand how different cultural practices might affect things like people working together, coming up with new ideas, or just how happy people are overall.
Right.
Even if we can't get rid of all the uncertainty, we can at least use science to make smarter choices about what kind of world we want to make.
So it's less about science giving us the exact plan for a perfect society, and more about giving us the tools to see the trade-offs involved in different cultural designs.
Exactly. Skinner was really into experimenting. He said we shouldn't just assume any cultural practice is right or wrong without trying it out and seeing what happens.
Wow, that's kind of radical, treating cultures like some big social experiment.
Yeah.
Sounds like it could be really insightful, but also a total disaster if things go wrong.
It definitely has its risks, but just sticking with old traditions, because that's how we've always done it, doesn't seem like a recipe for progress either.
Right, that makes sense.
Skinner thought we should approach designing cultures with a curious mind, always questioning what we think and changing course based on what we see happening.
Okay, I can see how that would be valuable. But if we're going to experiment like that, how do we even measure if those experiments are working? We talked about survival as a way to measure, but that seems too simple and maybe even dangerous if we take it too far.
You're right, just surviving isn't a very good way to measure success. It doesn't tell us anything about how good life is within that society. Skinner said we need to think bigger than just surviving and consider a bunch of different outcomes.
Like what? What are some other ways we can figure out if a cultural design is actually working?
Well, we could look at stuff like rates of mental illness, how much creativity and innovation is happening, or how much people are working together versus fighting with each other. We could even measure something like how happy people are overall or how satisfied they are with their lives. The important thing is to figure out our values and priorities first, and then use those as the yardstick to judge how well our cultural design is working.
So it always comes back to values, huh? Science can help us understand the consequences of our choices, but it can't tell us what we should ultimately value as a society. That's a conversation we have to have ourselves.
For sure. And that conversation is never really over. As societies change, so do their values and priorities. What might have been a successful culture 100 years ago might be totally useless for the challenges we face today. The key is to know about this back and forth between our values and our cultural practices and be ready to adapt when we need to.
That makes a lot of sense. It's like we're always trying to hit a target that's moving.
Yeah.
But even if we can't make a perfect culture, we can at least try to create societies that fit with our changing values and hopes.
Exactly. And that's where Skinner's ideas about reinforcement come in. He argued that if we want to encourage certain behaviors in a culture, we need to know how to use reinforcement well.
So this is where we circle back to the main ideas of behavioral science, right? That our actions are shaped by what happens afterward.
Right. Skinner thought we could use what we know about reinforcement to design cultures that encourage good behaviors like cooperation, empathy, and being creative. Instead of just using punishment to stop bad behavior, We could focus on rewarding the behaviors we want to see more of.
That sounds a lot more humane and optimistic than just trying to control people with fear and punishment.
Yeah.
But how do we actually do that on a societal level? I mean, rewarding every single good thing someone does seems pretty impossible.
You're right. It's not as easy as giving out prizes for every good deed.
Yeah.
But there are ways to build these ideas into our social systems. For example, we could design schools that focus on positive reinforcement, encouraging students to explore what they're passionate about, and rewarding effort and curiosity instead of just memorizing facts.
That would be awesome. And it's not just about school, right? We could use these ideas in other places like work, the justice system, or even how we interact with each other every day.
Exactly. The possibilities are huge. The key is to be aware of how our cultural practices, big or small, are shaping how we behave, and to be intentional about designing systems that encourage the kind of world we want to live in.
This is giving me so much to think about. Skinner's ideas, even though they're controversial sometimes, seem to give us a really powerful way to understand how we can shape better cultures. But where does this leave the individual? If our environment influences so much of what we do we have any control? Can we really make a difference?
That's a great question, and it takes us to one of Skinner's most important points. He said that even though our environment shapes us, we're not just passively letting it happen. We can and do influence our own behavior and the cultures we live in.
So it's not a one-way street.
Well,
We're not just puppets following our culture's lead.
Not at all. We can choose to challenge what's considered normal, question traditions, and fight for changes that match our values. We can choose to show good behavior, encourage good actions in other people, and speak up against things that are unfair.
That's way more empowering. It suggests that even though our cultures influence us, we can also influence them right back.
Exactly. We're both shaped by our cultures, and we shape them too. And by understanding how behavior works, we can be more aware and intentional in how we shape our world.
This whole conversation has really opened my eyes to how powerful cultural design can be. It's not just some abstract philosophical idea. It's something we're all doing, whether we realize it or not. And by understanding the forces at play, we can start making more deliberate choices about what kind of world we want to create. Okay, so we've talked about a lot here, from how cultures evolve kind of by accident to using science to try and create better societies. But I'm still thinking about what all of this means for me, just a regular person living in this crazy world. If we're both shaped by our cultures and shaping them at the same time, like you said, where do I even start?
Well, that's the big question, isn't it? And there's no one answer that fits everyone in every situation. But I think one of the most important things we can take away from Skinner's work is that we need to be more aware of how our environment is affecting how we behave.
Okay.
We need to pay attention to the subtle cues and things that reinforce our choices, all the time.
So it's about being more mindful of our surroundings, not just the physical stuff, but also the social norms and expectations that shape how we act.
Exactly. Once we start seeing those influences more clearly, we can start making more conscious choices about how we react to them.
Ugh.
We can decide to resist things that we think are unhealthy or don't help us.
Mhm.
We can choose to be in environments that support our values and goals.
Careful.
We can even try to change our surroundings to make them better for the kind of life we want to live.
That's a really powerful idea. It's like we're not just stuck watching these cultural forces happen. We can actually do something about it.
And that ability to act goes beyond just our own lives. We can use our understanding of behavior to fight for changes in our communities, our jobs, even government policies. We can push for systems that are kinder, fairer, and more in line with what we believe in.
So it's about taking what we know about behavior and using it to make positive change on a bigger level.
Exactly. Skinner believed that behavioral science could be a really powerful force for good. He thought that if we understood how behavior works, we could use that knowledge to create environments that help people thrive, work together, and even help cultures evolve in a positive way.
It's almost like we're all cultural engineers, in a way, whether we know it or not. Every choice we make, everything we do, helps shape the world around us.
And if we're going to be engineers, we might as well be good ones, right? We might as well learn the principles and use them to create something beautiful and lasting.
I love that. It really sums up what we've been talking about. So to our listeners, I'll leave you with this challenge. Start paying attention to how your environment is affecting your behavior. Think about the cultural forces that are influencing your choices, good and bad. And then ask yourself, what kind of world do you want to help build? What kind of culture do you want to be a part of?
And don't be afraid to experiment, to try new things, to push the boundaries of what's considered normal. Cultures are always changing, and we all play a role in shaping that change.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into cultural design. It's been a really eye-opening conversation. I hope it's inspired you to think more about the cultures we live in and how much power we have to shape them. Until next time.